The morning sun stretched its pale fingers across the base, casting long shadows over the concrete, and the barbed wire glinted coldly in the light, as if warning anyone who approached that rules were absolute. The air was crisp with the scent of dew and oil, and the low murmur of guards moving along their posts created a rhythm that pulsed with authority. She stepped onto the tarmac, carrying a small duffel bag, her shoulders squared and her steps steady. Her eyes scanned the towering fences and the checkpoint ahead. She had walked this path before in her mind, but today something felt different. The officer at the gate noticed her almost immediately, his posture rigid and his jaw tight. He was used to the routine of strangers and civilians, presenting papers and excuses, but there was something about her that made him pause. He leaned slightly forward and raised a hand, signaling her to stop. She complied instantly, her movements fluid and deliberate as if anticipating his every reaction. The morning air seemed to thicken around them, and even the guards nearby slowed their pace to watch. The woman was calm, but there was an edge to her that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. She reached for her bag and adjusted it over her shoulder, her eyes meeting his with a gaze that was steady and unyielding. The officer stepped closer, his boots clicking sharply against the pavement as he demanded her identification. Her hand went to the bag and then hesitated. She could feel the tension in the air and the small tightening of her chest. She knew every second counted in this moment of confrontation. The officer's eyes flicked to the bag and then back to her face, as if weighing the truth in her expression. She spoke softly, explaining her presence on the base, her voice calm and even as though rehearsed but carrying a hint of urgency that made him frown. He raised an eyebrow, unconvinced, and signaled to the guard standing slightly behind him to be ready. Should she have been allowed in? She did not know, but she could feel the weight of authority pressing against her shoulders and the faint sting of doubt that maybe today would be different than she expected. The officer took a step back and crossed his arms, his eyes scanning her from head to toe as if searching for a flaw, a reason to dismiss her. Her fingers brushed against the strap of her bag almost instinctively, as if holding on to something real in the middle of the tension. Her gaze did not waver. She had been in worse situations than this, and yet the quiet threat of being turned away made her stomach churn. The officer's voice rose slightly, demanding credentials and papers she could not produce. His tone carried the impatience of someone who had dealt with countless excuses and lies that morning and had no desire to deal with another. One of the guards murmured something under his breath, but the officer silenced him with a look that made him shrink back. She could feel the collective attention of the nearby soldiers on her, as if they too were waiting for the next move. The wind rustled the flags above the gate, and she noticed the way the metal clanged softly in the morning light. Her heart beat in rhythm with the echo of boots against concrete, and she knew that a single wrong move could change everything. She inhaled slowly, letting the air fill her lungs, and then exhaled, letting the tension leave her muscles in a controlled release. She lifted her arm slightly, adjusting the sleeve of her jacket, a small movement that seemed insignificant but was deliberate. She could feel the officer's eyes following her every motion, his attention caught by the subtle reveal that she was preparing something hidden from plain sight. The guard shifted uneasily, sensing the change in the officer's demeanor and the subtle shift in energy. She did not speak, waiting for the right moment for something to be seen, something that would alter the course of the encounter. The officer's hand twitched slightly near his radio as if about to call for backup or enforce the rules that had been drilled into him for years. Her pulse remained steady. She knew he was moments away from making a decision that could either send her away or stop him in his tracks. The sun rose higher, casting a harsh light that glinted off the metal fences and the helmets of the guards. She felt the warmth against her skin and the coolness of the shadows at her feet, and in that moment, she knew that Nothing about today was ordinary. The officer straightened his posture, his jaw tightening as he reached once more toward his radio. She felt the weight of authority pressing down on her, yet her movements remained deliberate, calm, and unbroken. She slowly rolled up her sleeve, revealing a glimpse of the tattoo beneath inked with symbols that carried weight and history. Her arm was steady, and the officer's eyes locked onto it immediately. The world seemed to slow for a moment, the air thick. With unspoken recognition, he froze mid-sentence, his hand halfway to the radio, and then halted completely. The guards nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden tension, as if they too could feel the weight of what had been revealed. The woman did not flinch. She kept her gaze on the officer, waiting silently for his reaction. The tattoo was not just ink. It was a story, a proof of survival and service that few could claim. The officer's eyes widened slightly, and a flicker of recognition passed over his face. He stepped back slightly, his hand lowering from the radio, and for the first time his voice faltered. She remained poised, her lips pressed together and her eyes steady, observing the sudden change in the man before her. The silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. The guards whispered softly among themselves, casting curious glances toward her. She felt the tension, but also the shift in perception, the unspoken acknowledgement that rules alone could not define this moment. The officer tilted his head slightly and studied her more carefully, the corners of his eyes narrowing as he took in the details, the subtle scars, the posture, the calmness that spoke of experiences beyond his immediate understanding. Yiki knew he was weighing every detail, every subtle clue that made up the essence of who she was and the history the tattoo represented. She waited without moving, knowing that any sign of weakness could alter the fragile balance of the moment. The air seemed charged with possibility and threat, and the morning carried the faint sound of distant engines and the low hum of conversations that did not reach them. Yet within the small circle around the gate, the world had narrowed to her and the officer, the weight of authority and the quiet power of her revealed history. She felt the minutes stretch and the tension thrum against her skin like an electric current. She did not speak, and he did not move. The moment hung suspended with the possibility of action or dismissal, and the question of what would happen next lingered in the air, leaving everything unresolved and full of anticipation. The officer blinked once-twice, trying to steady his thoughts as his eyes remained fixed on the tattoo, revealed beneath her sleeve. The symbols etched into her skin were precise and deliberate, a combination of marks and emblems that spoke of service that few would understand, and even fewer would survive. He took a step back instinctively, his hand brushing against the strap of his radio, but he did not call anyone. The recognition had stopped him cold. The woman's gaze remained unwavering, steady and calm as she watched him process what he had just seen. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm. With the quiet tension between them, she could feel the weight of his scrutiny, as if he was searching for lies or deceit, but finding none. The other guards shifted uneasily, their whispers carrying just below the sound of the wind passing through the metal fences. They sensed the change in the officer, the subtle shift from authority to cautious respect. The woman did not flinch. She had been in situations where every second counted and lives depended on control and composure. And now she applied the same discipline as she had in missions far from here. The officer's jaw tightened and he cleared his throat, attempting to regain authority, but his voice faltered when he finally spoke. The words were clipped, cautious, asking her name, her affiliation, and the story behind the tattoo. Her lips pressed together and she answered carefully, choosing each word to convey truth, without revealing too much too soon. She told a fragment of the story, Missions completed, impossible tasks survived. Comrades lost and scars earned in places far from home. The officer listened intently, his eyes narrowing as he weighed her words against the image on her arm. The guards glanced at each other, sensing the tension and the unusual deference creeping into the atmosphere. She remained poised, each movement deliberate, her hand brushing the strap of the duffel bag resting lightly against her shoulder, as if to remind herself that she could act if necessary. The officer stepped closer to study the tattoo further, the sunlight catching the ink, revealing details that confirmed what he had suspected. Her posture remained calm, but her mind was alert, scanning for threats, calculating possibilities, and anticipating his reaction. He tilted his head, slightly the faintest quiver of surprise passing through his eyes as he recalled stories from his own service, stories of soldiers with tattoos marking valor missions that had become legend. He felt a flicker of something unspoken, a connection, forged not by words but by shared understanding. She noticed the change in his expression, the hesitation, the pause between orders, the subtle shift in his tone. The moment hung thick with uncertainty, and yet a fragile respect had begun to form. He asked questions cautiously, probing details about her service, the missions that had left marks not just on her skin but on her soul. She responded sparingly, revealing enough to confirm the truth of her experience, but holding back the stories that would expose the full extent of her past. The air was charged with unspoken acknowledgement, the kind that passes between those who have seen the impossible and lived. She did not move from her spot, waiting for the officer to decide if she would be allowed through or sent away. His gaze traveled over her arms, her face, her stance, the slight scars that hinted at past battles, the way she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone trained to survive. The guards sensed his indecision, the crack in his authority that made them uneasy. They exchanged glances, whispering softly, but no one dared to speak loudly in case it disturbed the delicate balance unfolding at the gate. The officer finally exhaled slowly, as if releasing tension he had held without realizing it. His hands lowered from the radio, and for a moment he simply studied her, the sunlight glinting off the metal of his badge, casting reflections across the pavement. She waited, silently aware that any sudden move could tip the scale in either direction. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of vehicles and the faint echo of voices from inside the base. But around the gate, the world was reduced to the silent standoff. Between them, she allowed herself a small glance at the duffel bag she carried, the contents, ordinary yet necessary, a reminder of the mission she had been sent on, and the authority she did not yet wield. The officer's eyes flicked to the bag, but returned immediately to her face and tattoo. And in that instant, she felt the shift in the air, a subtle change in the rules that had governed this encounter. The recognition in his eyes was tempered by caution and curiosity. He took another step, closer, inspecting her stance, her posture, the way her shoulders squared and her chin lifted. She met his gaze, unwavering, her presence, calm yet assertive, as if challenging him silently to acknowledge the truth. The guards around them shuffled slightly, the tension making them uneasy, the whispers growing softer and fewer. Their attention was entirely on the unfolding drama. The officer, who had been ready to enforce rules and remove her, now seemed uncertain, unsure how to act in the face of a history he could not ignore. The woman could feel the moment stretching longer than it should, every second weighted with possibility, the knowledge that she had survived far more dangerous situations than this, but knowing that the judgment of this one man would determine her next step. The officer finally spoke his tone, measured, cautious probing for verification. She responded without hesitation, her words precise and deliberate, giving no room for doubt, yet withholding the full extent of her story. She could see the change in his demeanor, the slow shift from suspicion to tentative respect. The guards sensed it too. The subtle acknowledgement that this was not an ordinary visitor, but someone whose history demanded recognition. The air grew thick with anticipation as the officer studied her carefully, and then motioned slightly to one of the guards who had been lingering too close. He stepped back, the faintest nod passing between them. A silent understanding forming. The woman maintained her calm gaze, the faintest hint of a smile brushing her lips. She knew the moment had changed the trajectory of the encounter, but she did not yet know how far. The officer's eyes lingered on her tattoo, the symbols etched with meaning. A record of missions survived, comrades lost, and courage tested. He straightened slightly as if preparing to speak, and yet paused once more, the hesitation clear. She remained motionless, the stillness of her body reflecting the discipline that had carried her through far worse situations than this. The surrounding guards sensed the pause, the subtle shift in authority, and the respect being conveyed without words. Their whispers ceased as they realized this moment was beyond ordinary rules and regulations. The officer finally exhaled and lowered his gaze momentarily, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She did not move, waiting to see what decision he would make, the unspoken rules of recognition and respect hanging heavy. In the air, the wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of distant engines and voices from inside the base. But at the gate, the world remained suspended in the tense quiet as the officer processed the truth of her presence and the weight of the tattoo revealed before him, leaving the outcome uncertain and the air thick with suspense for what would come next. The officer stood frozen a moment longer, as if time itself had slowed down around the gate. His eyes traced every line of her tattoo. The intricate details, the marks that spoke of missions carried out under impossible circumstances, the sacrifices endured and the courage required to survive each one. His hand twitched slightly near his radio, but he did not call anyone. The recognition of what she had been through held him in place. The woman remained steady, her posture calm and unyielding, as though the weight of the moment pressed against her, and yet she bore it without hesitation. Her gaze never faltered. She met his eyes, fully aware that the story told by her tattoo had stopped him cold, and that in his mind he was weighing not rules or protocol, but the truth of her past. The surrounding guards shifted uneasily, whispering softly among themselves, sensing the unusual stillness in the air and the subtle tension that replaced the routine. The wind rustled the flags above the gate, clanging softly against the metal posts and carrying a faint scent of fuel and concrete, as if the base itself had paused to witness the moment. The officer cleared his throat, trying to regain authority, but the sound came out hoarse and uncertain. The woman allowed herself a small movement, adjusting the strap of her duffel bag, her eyes flicking briefly to the tattoo, as if to confirm that the message had been received. She felt the shift in the officer, the recognition and the hesitation, the subtle change that transformed him from an enforcer of rules into a man grappling with history and respect. He stepped, closer still, studying her, the light catching the ink, revealing every detail with cruel clarity. Her hand remained lightly on the strap of her bag, ready to react if necessary, but she did not move aggressively. Instead, she stood with a quiet confidence that only someone who had faced life and death could command. The officer's jaw tightened and he exhaled slowly, the exhale heavy with memories of his own service, the moments where he had seen courage and survival in ways that could not be explained. To civilians, he studied the faint scars visible on her arms and the way her shoulders held the weight of something far beyond ordinary experience. The surrounding guards sensed the shift in power, the unspoken acknowledgement forming between the two, and they instinctively stepped back, giving space to the encounter. The woman remained calm, letting the silence stretch between them, letting every second communicate the story of resilience and discipline. The officer's eyes flicked down briefly, to her duffel bag, and then back to her face, the recognition deepening with every glance. He remembered the stories of those who bore similar tattoos, the ones who had returned against all odds, and the ones who had not. He recalled the lessons learned, and the unspoken bonds formed in situations where trust was earned through action rather than words. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence alone conveyed the depth of her history. The officer finally broke the silence, his voice cautious, low-measured, asking her to explain her presence on the base, the missions referenced by the tattoo, and the truth behind the marks. She responded evenly carefully, revealing fragments of her story missions that had seemed impossible. Comrades lost, and battles survived, the words precise but sparing giving, just enough to satisfy his immediate curiosity without exposing everything. Her eyes remained steady on his, watching for the slightest flicker of doubt or disbelief. The officer nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as the fragments confirmed what he suspected. The guards around them whispered softly among themselves, the change in the officer palpable, the respect forming like an invisible thread connecting them. The woman sensed the shift. She had faced scrutiny far harsher and more dangerous in the past, and yet the intensity of this moment felt unique, as if the entire base was holding its breath waiting for the next move. He stepped back slightly, his hand lowering from the radio, as if acknowledging that the decision was no longer about enforcing rules, but about recognizing the truth of who she was. The tattoo had done what words could not. It had paused authority and replaced suspicion with tentative respect. She adjusted her bag again, letting the subtle movement communicate readiness and calm, as if to silently say that she belonged here, even if the officer had not realized it fully yet. The wind carried the faint hum of engines and distant voices from inside the base, but the gate remained a suspended arena where two lives intersected, history and authority, clashing and merging silently. He finally spoke again, this time his tone softer, the question indirect, asking about the missions and the significance of the symbols on her skin. She answered with precision, hinting at dangers survived, challenges overcome, and the cost paid, without revealing the full magnitude. The officer listened intently, his eyes narrowing slightly, processing each word and comparing it to the evidence written across her arm. The guard sensed the importance of the moment, the weight of recognition, and the unusual quiet that had replaced routine. The woman remained poised, letting the officer digest the truth, her presence a steady reminder that some things could not be judged by protocol alone. The officer took another step closer, inspecting her posture, her stance, her confidence, and the faint scars revealed. By the rising sun, his mind raced, recalling comrades lost and victories earned, and the unspoken code that connected those who had endured the unimaginable. She did not speak. She did not need to. The tattoo told enough. The scars told enough. And her composure told the rest. He tilted his head slightly, studying her eyes, the flicker of experience and control contained there, the silent acknowledgement of missions carried out and dangers faced. The surrounding guards watched carefully, sensing the subtle transfer of power, the shift from authority to recognition. They whispered softly among themselves, speculating on who she might be and the significance of what they had just witnessed. The woman adjusted her sleeve, slightly exposing the tattoo, more fully letting the details shine in the sunlight, as if daring the officer to ignore the truth. The officer exhaled slowly, his hands relaxing and his posture shifting slightly, acknowledging silently that this was no ordinary civilian. This was someone who had walked through fire-faced impossible odds and survived, and her presence here demanded recognition, not dismissal. The air seemed to thrum with tension and understanding, the gate a stage for a confrontation that had become a quiet acknowledgement of past and present. She remained silent, poised and alert, ready for whatever decision the officer would make next. The moment stretched long, heavy with anticipation, and yet charged with the electric pulse of stories, untold histories, survived and respect earned without words. The officer finally nodded slightly, his expression softening a fraction, signaling that he was ready to allow her next step. But the uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. She sensed it and held her position, ready to respond, the duffel bag light against her shoulder, and the tattoo, a silent testament to all that had brought her to this moment. The guards shifted again, uneasily, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied ordinary protocol and yet demanded acknowledgement. The wind carried faint echoes of distant voices and engines, and the clanging of metal against metal as if the base itself was aware of the weight of the encounter. The officer studied her, one final time before speaking carefully, the words measured and deliberate, acknowledging her presence and asking once more for confirmation of her identity. She responded calmly, letting every word communicate truth without revealing the full magnitude. Leaving the officer suspended in thought, the decision balanced delicately between protocol and recognition. The gate a liminal space where history and authority collided, leaving every observer tense and every possibility unresolved and full of anticipation. The officer remained still, his eyes locked on the tattoo, tracing the lines and symbols that spoke of missions survived and courage tested beyond measure. The woman stood calm and steady, her posture, unwavering as if the weight of the moment pressed against her, and yet she bore it without hesitation. The guards nearby shifted uneasily, sensing the tension and the unusual pause in routine. Their whispers were faint, almost swallowed by the hum of the morning wind, rustling the barbed wire fences above. The officer exhaled slowly, a deep, controlled breath, trying to steady himself, his mind racing, recalling stories of soldiers marked with similar tattoos, comrades' lost victories earned, and the silent bonds formed through shared danger. He studied the faint scars on her arms, the quiet strength in her stance, and the disciplined calm in her eyes. She adjusted her bag slightly, letting the movement communicate readiness and control without breaking her composure. He took another step closer, tilting his head slightly, his gaze narrowing as he tried to reconcile protocol with the undeniable truth of her presence. Her eyes met his, fully unwavering and steady, conveying history, experience, and courage that words could never express. The air seemed charged heavy with anticipation, the quiet tension vibrating like a taut wire waiting for the next move. The woman remained silent, letting the moment stretch, each second full of unspoken acknowledgement of past missions impossible, tasks survived, and lives preserved. The officer finally spoke, his voice, low, cautious, and measured, asking her to explain the story behind the tattoo. She responded deliberately, giving fragments of her past missions, moments of danger and survival, comrades lost, and the price of courage. Her words were precise, sparing, giving just enough truth to satisfy his immediate curiosity without revealing the full extent of her history. He listened intently, eyes flicking between her face and the tattoo, confirming the fragments she shared and noting the subtle scars revealed by the sunlight. The guards sensed the shift in authority, the change from suspicion to hesitant respect. They whispered softly among themselves, speculating and watching closely. The woman stood poised, letting silence and composure convey more than words could, the tattoo telling the story and her presence confirming it. The officer exhaled again, this time with more weight, acknowledging silently that rules alone could not dictate this moment. She adjusted her sleeve slightly, exposing more of the tattoo, letting the intricate lines and marks shine in the light, as if daring him to ignore the truth. His gaze lingered, and he nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth tightening, slightly as if understanding what had been unspoken. The air hummed with tension and recognition, the moment suspended between protocol and respect. The guards shifted again, giving space, feeling the unusual balance of power and acknowledgement. The woman's eyes remained fixed on his, watching every flicker of reaction, every subtle movement, aware that the decision to allow her entry or not was still precarious. The officer finally exhaled deeply, lowering his hands, completely his posture. Relaxing slightly, but his gaze never leaving the tattoo or the woman. She remained poised, ready, calm, and alert, letting the tension stretch, the moment charged with anticipation and unspoken understanding, leaving everyone at the gate suspended, waiting for the next move in silence. The officer finally stepped back slightly, his eyes never leaving the tattoo, as if trying to absorb every detail, the lines, the symbols, the meaning behind each mark. The woman remained still, her posture calm and poised, ready for whatever decision would come next. The surrounding guards sensed the tension, the quiet shift from suspicion to cautious respect, and instinctively gave space, their whispers fading into silence. The wind rustled the flags above the gate, carrying the faint metallic scent of the base and the distant hum of engines. The officer exhaled slowly, his hands dropping completely to his sides, his jaw tightening slightly as he tried to reconcile the authority he held with the undeniable truth before him. He took a careful step closer, tilting his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. Her eyes and the calm strength she radiated. She adjusted her bag lightly, her movements deliberate, controlled, communicating readiness and composure, without a word. The officer finally spoke, his voice low, deliberate and careful, asking her to confirm her identity and explain the mission suggested by the tattoo. She answered evenly, sparing the details, giving enough to satisfy his immediate concern while withholding the full scope of her history. Her eyes never left his, holding his gaze steady, challenging him silently to acknowledge the truth. He nodded slowly, processing each word, each detail of the tattoo and each subtle scar revealed in the sunlight. The guards sensed the shift fully, now the unusual quiet and the weight of history and respect hanging in the air. The woman remained silent, letting the pause stretch the tension thick around them, each second charged with unspoken understanding of courage, endured lives risked, and battles survived. The officer finally exhaled again, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he acknowledged silently that she was no ordinary civilian, that she had walked through fire, faced impossible odds and survived, and that the rules he had intended to enforce were meaningless against the truth he now saw in front of him. She adjusted her sleeve, exposing the tattoo more fully, letting the intricate marks shine in the light, as if daring anyone to ignore them. His eyes lingered, her gaze remained steady, the air vibrating with anticipation and quiet recognition. The guards moved subtly, giving space as the officer's stance shifted from suspicion to reluctant respect. The woman felt the moment change the balance of authority, tilting toward acknowledgement. She remained poised, calm, and alert, her duffel bag light on her shoulder and the tattoo, a testament to history, courage, and unspoken truth, leaving everyone at the gate suspended, waiting for what would come next.